James Cook, who voyaged on the HMS Endeavour, departed from England and founded Australia. While on the Endeavour in 1770, Cook discovered New Zealand and also the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. Cook's voyage in April of 1770 took place on the HMS Endeavour and was able to make landfall on the east coast of Australia at Point Hicks, and then went onward to Botany Bay. The National Museum of Australia stated, upon the arrival in 1770, Lieutenant James Cook claimed the eastern portion of the Australian continent for the British Crown in 1770. Cook named it New South Wales. 18 years following the first landfall and claim of the eastern land of Australia, the first fleet arrived to establish a penal colony in the newly formed New South Wales. On May 13, 1787, the first fleet of military leaders, sailors, and convicts set sail from Portsmouth, England to find the first European colony in Australia, Botany Bay. The first fleet was a combination of officers, marines, and also their families, as well as convicts from Britain. The settlers settled in Sydney Cove. The place was chosen for the settlers because it had fresh water and good anchorage for their fleet of ships. The convict settlers were not put in prisons or jails. They were put to work as laborers, servants, farm servants, and other trades. They were usually forced to do things that they were unwilling to do, which often led to protests. While the convicts were usually coerced, they were also given incentives such as always being extremely well fed, up to twice the daily calorie dose that the English wished to receive. The convicts did not remain convicts long after they arrived to the new continent. After 5 years of arriving in Australia, 85% of the convicts were set free. Once they were free, they were eligible to qualify for land grants. Liberty and freedom to do as they wish were at their doorstep. The emancipated and the convicts created a society that they wanted to create, which was highly urban. Most convicts strive for the ticket of leave, which awarded the convicts with their own personal freedom, which meant a convict could work for himself or herself, earning money and enjoying more freedom. But why were the convicts shipped to Australia in the first place? After the American War for Independence ended, America refused to accept any more convicts from England. Therefore, England was forced to find a different location to transport their prisoners to. England came up with the solution of sending their prisoners to what they now called the New South Wales. The primary reason for sending convicts to New South Wales was because England was running out of physical room for the convicts. England had people who often had to steal food or other things in order to survive. The punishment for stealing items or other petty crimes could land you in New South Wales. The disruption of the Aborigines people. When England sent fleets of ships to Sydney Cove in New South Wales, Aborigines people were present. The Aborigines people included people that were there prior to England's colonization. The Aboriginal people were already living in the land that England colonized for thousands of years. Surprisingly, the convicts also lived in local villages near the Aboriginal people. The Aboriginal people also camped near the convicts' houses, fished on the harbor, traded goods and food with townsfolk, and brought news from further away. The Aboriginal people, along with the settlers, had lived a life where they mingled and lived closely. Although England claimed the land of East Australia to themselves, the Aboriginal people that were previously settled in that location were pushed off of their lands or killed by the diseases such as smallpox, chickenpox, influenzas, and measles. While some died from diseases, others died from the colonists killing them off. As stated from the Cultural Survival Quarterly magazine, after European settlers arrived in 1788, thousands of Aborigines died from diseases, and colonists systematically killed many others. At first contact, there were over 250,000 Aborigines in Australia. The massacres ended in the 1920s, leaving no more than 60,000 Aborigines people. The areas with the greatest population of the Aboriginal people took the biggest hit and seen a widespread population decline. The Aboriginal communities weakened drastically from the loss of their land, death and illnesses caused by diseases, and loss of food by the settlers. Substance abuse from things such as alcohol, tobacco, and opium have served a severe problem for the indigenous communities. The racial stereotypes, as depicted in the illustration by Julie Dowling, shows that the non-indigenous people believe that all Aborigines people have a problem with alcohol, and that the non-indigenous people do not. As seen in the previous chart, though, the non-indigenous people often consumed more alcohol. Most but not all relationships were peaceful among the indigenous groups with settlers until major conflicts of land, such as later in the 1820s with the Black War. The frontier wars were conflicts among the Aboriginal people and the Europeans. The wars were not entirely just wars, they were also acts of resistance and open massacres from 1788 to the early 1930s. The Black War of Tasmania lasted from the mid-1820s to 1832 and is arguably one of the bigger conflicts on the frontier of Australia. The Tasmanian Aborigines resisted the white colonizers and the outcome was death except for only a few who had survived, and the British gained control of Tasmania. European settlers also greatly impacted Aborigines people by killing more animals than they truly needed. The settlers were often given food and went out and killed more for when they were hungry. This impacted the Aborigines because animals were the primary source of food, therefore when the colonizers began pulling from the Aborigines' food pile, the Aborigines people began to starve and potentially starve to death. As depicted in the photo, you can see how skinny and malnourished the Aborigines people appear when the colonizers began to settle. Some of the Aborigines people were captured and used as slaves. After the fight for independence in America, the British could no longer ship their convicts to the Americas. The Europeans were in desperate need of finding a new location to send their convicts. The British decided to send them to New South Wales. While the convicts and European colonizers were settling in Australia, they ran into the Aboriginal people. Some of the Aboriginal people could live peacefully alongside the European settlers until the settlers began to take their land, hurt their group, culture, and their way of life. The formation of the Australia Penal Colony did help alleviate Great Britain and Ireland's convict population, but while doing so, the colonizers disrupted the native Aborigines people. The referendum of 1967 Commonwealth gave Parliament power to make laws with respect to Aboriginal people wherever they lived in Australia. Previously, the indigenous people of Australia were included in the census, but not in the official population estimate. Section 127 of the Constitution excluded Aboriginal people from being counted in the census. Therefore, the referendum of 1967 withdrew Section 127 and allowed them to be counted in the census. The referendum also spoke out to give the indigenous people more equality and freedom. The Aboriginal people are not given the same opportunities as others, both growing up and living in Australia. Even suicide rates for Aboriginal children are 5 times higher than the rest of the population, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. With the referendum of 1967, equality has not been specifically given. The Aborigines people still feel excluded and their voices oppressed. In a news article that was published in February of 2019, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said that only 2 of the 7 government targets to improve the wealth, health, and well-being of the first Australians were being met.